Miriam had always thought of her town as a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Nestled in the embrace of rolling hills, the small village bustled with the rhythm of its people, from the morning bell of the church to the laughter spilling out of the market square. Everyone knew everyone, or so it seemed. Life here was predictable, peaceful, and perhaps a little mundane. Miriam, a florist by trade, found solace in the simplicity. Her mornings were spent arranging fresh blooms, and her afternoons involved delivering them to her loyal customers, each bouquet carrying a message of love, apology, or remembrance. On this particular day, the sun painted the cobbled streets gold, and the market was alive with chatter. Vendors called out their wares, brightly colored fabrics, ripened fruit, and glistening trinkets, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted peanuts and spices. Miriam, balancing a basket of white lilies on her hip, wove through the crowd with practiced ease. Her destination was the home of an elderly vendor who had recently fallen ill. Delivering flowers to her was not just business, it was a gesture of kindness. Meanwhile, across the market, Joseph adjusted his hat against the sun's glare. He wasn't supposed to be here, not today. As a schoolteacher, his life followed the strict rhythm of lessons and responsibilities. But he had promised his young students a story about the town's history, and he wanted to find an artifact in the market that could make the tale come alive. A brass bracelet, perhaps, or an old carving, something that carried the weight of generations. The moment that changed everything began as a hum in the air, a warning unnoticed by most. A cart piled high with sacks of grain, left unattended on a slight incline, began to roll. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, it hurtled toward the heart of the market where Miriam had just stopped to greet an old acquaintance. Joseph, who was examining a stand of wooden masks, heard the shout before he saw the danger. "Watch out," someone screamed, but the crowd, paralyzed by shock, did not move. An elderly vendor, too slow to escape, stood directly in the cart's path. Joseph dropped the mask he was holding and lunged forward, his heart pounding. He reached the vendor just in time to pull her aside, but in the chaos, he stumbled, falling into the street. Miriam, witnessing the scene unfold, acted without thinking. She dashed forward to help, her basket of lilies tumbling to the ground. Together, she and Joseph managed to push the cart to a stop before it could cause further harm. The market, stunned into silence, erupted in applause. Breathing heavily, Joseph turned to Miriam, their eyes meeting for the first time. "Thank you," he managed, still catching his breath. "You were brave," Miriam said, her voice steady, but her hands trembling. "But next time, maybe don't play hero alone." Joseph chuckled despite himself. "Noted. But it seems I wasn't alone." For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. They stood there, strangers bound by an act of instinct, surrounded by scattered lilies and the murmurs of the crowd. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the spell broke. The market resumed its rhythm, and the two of them went their separate ways, Miriam to gather her flowers, and Joseph to find the artifact he had come for. Yet neither could shake the feeling that something profound had just happened. Later that evening, as Miriam closed her shop, she found something strange in her basket among the bruised lilies, a bracelet, dull with age, but bearing an intricate design. She was certain it hadn't been there before. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the faint etching of an unfamiliar symbol. It looked ancient, almost sacred. She wondered if it had fallen from the runaway cart or been dropped by someone in the crowd. Either way, it didn't belong to her. She resolved to return it to the market the next day, unaware that Joseph, sitting in his small apartment across town, was staring at his own wrist where a similar bracelet had been just hours ago. The next morning, the market awakened slowly, the first rays of sunlight painting the rooftops in hues of orange and gold. Miriam walked through the narrow streets, the bracelet tucked carefully into her satchel. She couldn't shake the unease she had felt since finding it. The intricate design on the bracelet seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she had seen it before. Perhaps someone in the market would recognize it. As she approached her usual flower stall, the hustle of the marketplace seemed different today. Whispers followed her, subtle and almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder as she moved through the crowd. Heads turned, eyes glanced quickly in her direction before darting away. It was unusual, unnerving. Miriam had always been well liked in the town, her flowers a source of joy to many. What had changed? The answer revealed itself soon enough. As Miriam set up her stall, a group of women from the market's weaving circle approached her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. The oldest among them, Auntie Adwoa, leaned in close. "Miriam," she began, her voice low but firm, "what happened yesterday has everyone talking. They say you and Joseph stopped that cart together, and now people are wondering," she trailed off, her words heavy with implication. "Wondering what?" Miriam asked, frowning. Adwoa sighed, her weathered hands resting on her hips. "Joseph is engaged, my dear. To Naya, the daughter of the bakery family. People are saying they saw something in the way you two looked at each other. They're talking about fate, about old stories." Miriam's heart sank. She had done nothing wrong, yet the weight of the market's collective imagination was already pressing down on her. She glanced at her satchel, where the mysterious bracelet lay, and felt a shiver run down her spine. Was this what they meant by fate? A mere coincidence being spun into something larger, something uncontrollable? Meanwhile, Joseph stood at the edge of the market, a conflicted expression on his face. He had not intended to come back today, but his thoughts had been restless all night. The image of Miriam, standing amidst a sea of lilies, haunted him. He couldn't understand why. His life was supposed to be simple, structured. His engagement to Naya had been arranged years ago, a union meant to solidify ties between their families. It was not a love match, but it was expected, and Joseph had always done what was expected of him. And yet, the bracelet complicated everything. It wasn't just an object, it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations, said to symbolize unbreakable bonds. How it had ended up in Miriam's possession was a mystery he needed to solve. When he finally spotted her at her stall, his resolve hardened. He approached cautiously, aware of the eyes that followed his every step. "Miriam," he said softly, his voice carrying over the hum of the market. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Joseph," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I need to talk to you," he said, glancing around nervously. "Somewhere private." The request took her by surprise, but she nodded. Together, they walked to a quieter corner of the market, near an old well, surrounded by ancient baobab trees. Once there, Miriam reached into her satchel and pulled out the bracelet, holding it out to him. "This," she said simply. "I believe it's yours." Joseph's eyes widened as he took the bracelet, his fingers trembling. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my basket after the incident yesterday," she explained. "I thought it might have fallen during the chaos." He turned the bracelet over in his hands, his mind racing. The design was unmistakable, a sunburst surrounded by interwoven vines. His grandmother had once told him the story of the bracelet, a tale rooted in the town's folklore. According to legend, it was crafted by an ancient blacksmith who claimed it held the power to reveal true love. Over the years, it had become a symbol in his family, worn only by those who had found their destined partner. Joseph looked up at Miriam, the weight of the bracelet heavy in his palm. "This shouldn't be possible," he said, shaking his head. "The bracelet, it's been in my family for generations. It's supposed to stay with the one who wears it. For it to end up with you," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Miriam frowned. "I don't understand. Are you saying this bracelet means something more than just a family heirloom?" He hesitated, then nodded. "It's said to bind the fates of two people. But that's just a story, right? A myth." She crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "And yet, here it is. With me. What does that say?" Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Miriam and Joseph turned to see Naya, her gaze sharp and her posture stiff. She had followed Joseph from a distance, her suspicions growing with each passing moment. Now, seeing him alone with Miriam, the bracelet glinting in his hand, her face darkened. "What is going on here?" Naya demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Joseph stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Naya, it's not what you think. I was just—" "You were just what?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Conspiring with her?" "I've heard the whispers, Joseph. People are saying you've been chosen by fate, that this bracelet proves it. Do you realize how humiliating this is for me? For my family?" Miriam opened her mouth to defend herself, but Naya's glare silenced her. "And you," Naya said, turning her ire on Miriam. "Do you think you can just waltz in and disrupt everything? Joseph is mine. This," she gestured to the bracelet, "means nothing." "Enough," Joseph said firmly, his voice steady. "Naya, please. Let me explain." But Naya wasn't interested in explanations. With a final look of disdain, she turned on her heel and stormed off, leaving Joseph and Miriam standing in the shadow of the baobab trees. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of their predicament settling heavily on their shoulders. As they stood there, Miriam couldn't help but wonder, was the bracelet truly a symbol of destiny, or was it simply a relic of the past, its meaning twisted by coincidence and superstition? And if it was fate, what did that mean for them? For their future? Joseph, still holding the bracelet, seemed to be grappling with the same questions. For the first time in his life, he felt the pull of something greater than duty, something he couldn't ignore. But the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, and the choices they made now would ripple through their lives, and the lives of everyone in the town, for years to come. The next few days passed in a blur of whispers and uneasy glances. The market, once a place of familiar comfort for Miriam, had become an arena for judgment. Everywhere she went, she could feel the eyes on her, curious, skeptical, even disapproving. It was as if the entire town had turned into a stage for a play she never auditioned for. And in this performance, she had become the unwanted protagonist, the character who disrupted the natural order. It wasn't long before people began to speak openly. "I heard Miriam is trying to steal Joseph from Naya," a woman from the bakery said to her friend as Miriam passed by. "That bracelet was just the beginning. The moment they laid eyes on each other, you could see it. They're destined, those two." "Ridiculous," the friend replied, lowering her voice. "The bracelet might have belonged to his family, but there's nothing destined about it. Naya's the one who's meant to marry him. It's all settled." Miriam heard these words all too often. It seemed like the town was dividing itself into two factions, those who believed in the ancient tale of fate and those who thought it was all nonsense. And at the center of it all stood Miriam, the woman caught in the storm. But as the days went on, something unexpected began to happen. Joseph, who had kept his distance since the incident in the market, started showing up at Miriam's stall. At first, it was just brief visits, a nod of acknowledgement, or a polite inquiry about the flowers she was selling. But slowly, those visits grew longer, the conversations deeper. He asked her about her family, her childhood, and her thoughts on the town's traditions. She found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else. There was a comfort in his presence, despite the tension that seemed to hang between them like a cloud. One afternoon, as they sat on the wooden bench outside her shop, Joseph leaned forward, his eyes troubled. "Miriam," he began quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about the bracelet. My grandmother used to tell me stories about it, but I never truly believed them. Now, I don't know what to think. It's just too much of a coincidence that it ended up with you." Miriam met his gaze, her heart heavy. "I don't understand, Joseph. It's just a bracelet. If it means so much to your family, I can return it. I didn't ask for any of this." He shook his head, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "I know you didn't. But the more I think about it, the more I can't ignore the feeling that something is pulling us together. And it scares me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The engagement to Naya. It was arranged long ago. My family expects it. My future, my role in the community, everything is tied to this union. But now, I'm not so sure. I can't pretend I don't feel something between us." Miriam's heart skipped a beat. His words, though hesitant, were a stark contrast to the confident man she had first met. It was as if the weight of tradition and expectation was slowly cracking, and in the spaces between, something real, something raw, was emerging. "I didn't ask for this either, Joseph," Miriam replied softly. "But if I'm being honest, I can't deny what I feel either. The bracelet may just be an object, but there's something about it, something about you, that I can't ignore." He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to say something he had been holding back. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "That maybe fate isn't just a myth. Maybe it's something we create, something we choose to believe in." Just then, the sudden screech of the town's bell interrupted their conversation. It was a signal, an emergency, a warning that something had happened. The town square erupted in chaos as people gathered around a small group near the fountain. Miriam and Joseph stood up, instinctively moving toward the noise. When they arrived, they found the scene even more unsettling than expected. Naya stood in the center, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was speaking in hushed tones to several villagers, her words laced with fear and frustration. "What's going on?" Joseph asked, pushing his way through the crowd. Naya looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mix of accusation and distress. "It's my father," she said, her voice quivering. "He's gone missing." A murmur ran through the crowd. The bakery family was one of the most powerful in the region, and the disappearance of their patriarch was nothing short of alarming. The news hit the community like a shockwave. No one could understand how or why it had happened. Joseph's mind raced, his heart torn between his loyalty to his family and his growing feelings for Miriam. "I need to help. This is serious," he said urgently. But as he turned to Miriam, he noticed the concern on her face, the worry in her eyes. "I'll go with you," Miriam said, her voice firm. "You shouldn't face this alone." The two of them, despite the chaos unfolding around them, made their way to the bakery family estate, where the search for Naya's father had already begun. The house was bustling with activity, guards stationed at every corner, and relatives huddled together in tense conversation. It felt like a different world, a place of power and influence that Miriam had never been a part of. "Joseph," Naya's voice cracked as she approached them. "You need to find him. You're his only hope." Joseph nodded solemnly. He knew that whatever had happened was far beyond his understanding. The more he saw of Naya's family, the more he realized how deeply rooted their influence was in the town. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this disappearance, something tied to the strange events that had unfolded since he met Miriam. As the search party moved into the woods, Joseph's mind couldn't help but drift back to the mysterious bracelet and the bond that seemed to be pulling him in Miriam's direction. It was as if the town's old stories, the ones about fate and love, were beginning to weave themselves into the very fabric of his reality. And with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. For Joseph, this wasn't just about finding Naya's father anymore. It was about confronting the choices he had been avoiding and facing the consequences of his growing feelings for Miriam. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air thick with tension, Joseph and Miriam found themselves side by side, united not just by circumstance, but by a force neither of them fully understood. And as they walked, the bracelet that had once been a mere object now seemed like the key to unlocking a truth neither of them could ignore. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig echo like a warning. The search party, a mixture of Naya's family guards and concerned villagers, fanned out under the dense canopy, lanterns in hand, casting flickering light that danced across the trees. Miriam and Joseph stayed close together, their unspoken understanding serving as a fragile tether in the tension-filled night. Miriam couldn't shake the growing unease in her chest. Something about the forest felt wrong, almost unnatural. Though she wasn't a superstitious woman, the tales whispered by the elders about these woods crept into her thoughts. Stories of people lured into the depths by unseen forces, never to return. She glanced at Joseph, who moved with purpose, but carried the same shadow of worry in his eyes. After hours of searching, they came upon a clearing. The moonlight spilled onto a patch of earth that seemed oddly untouched by time. In the center stood an ancient tree, its gnarled roots clawing into the ground like a beast. It was there that they found the first clue, a leather satchel, frayed at the edges, lying half-buried beneath the twisted roots. Naya's sharp gasp pierced the air as she recognized it. "That's my father's," she cried, rushing forward. Joseph grabbed her arm, stopping her before she could disturb the scene. "Wait," he said, his voice low but firm. "This doesn't feel right." The others in the party gathered around, murmuring among themselves, the unease spreading like wildfire. One of the older guards knelt down, inspecting the bag. He opened it carefully, revealing a few scattered papers, a worn journal, and a silver flask. But no sign of its owner. "What does this mean?" Naya demanded, her voice shaking. "Where is he?" Before anyone could answer, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the clearing. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to vibrate through the ground. The search party froze, their lanterns trembling in their hands. Miriam felt a chill run down her spine as she scanned the dark edges of the clearing. The sound wasn't natural, it was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the world she knew. Joseph stepped closer to her, his hand brushing hers in a fleeting moment of reassurance. "Everyone, back away from the tree," one of the guards barked, his voice tinged with panic. "Now!" But before they could move, the ground beneath the ancient tree began to shift. The roots twisted and writhed as if alive, revealing a dark opening, a hole leading into the earth. The sound grew louder, now accompanied by a faint, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat echoing from the depths. Naya's face went pale, but she refused to look away. "He's down there," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know he is." Joseph turned to her, his expression torn. "We don't know that. This could be dangerous." "I don't care," she interrupted, her desperation cutting through his words. "That's my father. If you're too afraid, I'll go alone." Joseph hesitated, glancing at Miriam. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, but there was something else there too, determination. He knew she wouldn't back down, not if there was even a chance of helping. "I'll go," Miriam said suddenly, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. "You stay with the others. If something happens, someone needs to know." "No," Joseph said firmly. "I'm going with you." Before Naya could protest, the two of them moved toward the opening, their lanterns casting long shadows on the shifting roots. The others watched in silence, their fear rendering them immobile. As Miriam and Joseph stepped into the darkness, the sound of the forest seemed to vanish, replaced by the rhythmic pounding that now felt almost like a chant. The descent was treacherous. The narrow tunnel was lined with jagged rocks and damp soil, and the air grew colder with each step. Miriam's lantern flickered, its light barely piercing the gloom. She felt Joseph's presence behind her, his steady breathing a small comfort in the oppressive silence. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a cavern. The space was vast, its walls glistening with moisture and faintly illuminated by a strange, bluish light that seemed to emanate from the very stone. At the center of the cavern stood a pedestal, carved from the same ancient rock, and on it rested a small, golden box. Surrounding the pedestal were carvings etched into the ground, their patterns intricate and strange, unlike anything Miriam had ever seen. But what truly drew their attention was the figure lying on the ground near the pedestal. It was Naya's father, his body motionless, his face pale but peaceful. Miriam rushed to his side, her heart pounding. She checked for a pulse and found one, faint but steady. "He's alive," she whispered, relief flooding her voice. Joseph knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the room. "What is this place?" he muttered, his gaze fixed on the carvings. "It feels ancient." As they examined the scene, a sudden tremor shook the cavern. The carvings began to glow, their light pulsating in rhythm with the pounding sound that had led them here. Miriam's eyes widened as she noticed the bracelet on Joseph's wrist, the one she had returned to him, beginning to glow as well. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice tinged with panic. "I don't know," Joseph admitted, his voice tight. "But I think we triggered something." Before they could react, the golden box on the pedestal began to open. A soft, golden light spilled out, filling the cavern with warmth. Inside was a small, perfectly round stone, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The moment the box opened, the pounding sound ceased, replaced by a profound silence. Joseph reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing the stone. The moment he made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, causing him to gasp. Images flooded his mind, visions of the bracelet, of Miriam, of paths converging and diverging, of choices that shaped destinies. He saw the town, the people, and himself standing at a crossroads. "Miriam," he said, his voice trembling. "This stone, it's showing me things. It's like it knows." She reached for his arm, concern etched on her face. "Joseph, stop. We don't know what this is." But he shook his head, his gaze locked on the stone. "It's fate," he said, his voice steady now. "It's trying to tell us something." As the light from the stone enveloped them, Miriam felt a strange calm wash over her. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a sense of clarity, as if the answers they sought were finally within reach. But with those answers came new questions, new fears. What was the true purpose of the stone? And what role did they play in the story it was weaving? As they lifted Naya's father and began their ascent back to the surface, the stone's light faded, leaving them with only its lingering warmth. The cavern seemed to watch them go, its secrets intact, its purpose only partially revealed. But one thing was clear, their lives, and the lives of everyone in the town, would never be the same again. Emerging from the dark tunnel into the open night air, Miriam, Joseph, and Naya's father were met with a sea of worried faces. The search party huddled together, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of the unconscious man and the expressions on Miriam and Joseph's faces, haunted, yet resolute. The relief was palpable, but the eerie energy from the cavern still clung to Miriam like a shadow. Naya rushed forward, dropping to her knees, beside her father. "Papa," she cried, her voice trembling as she cradled his head. Though he remained unconscious, his breathing was steady. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she looked up at Joseph. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." Joseph glanced at Miriam, then back to Naya. "We did what anyone would have," he said, though his voice carried the weight of everything they'd seen. He wasn't sure if Naya or anyone else could ever truly understand what had transpired below. As the group began to make their way back to the village, whispers spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted to know what had happened in the forest, but neither Miriam nor Joseph was ready to explain. The golden stone and its strange power felt too monumental, too otherworldly to put into words. Instead, they focused on returning Naya's father safely to his family, hoping the answers would come in time. The next morning, the village was abuzz. News of the rescue had reached every corner, and people gathered outside the bakery estate, eager for updates. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Naya's father had regained consciousness, but remained weak, his voice barely above a whisper. Naya stayed by his side, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being left unsaid. When she pressed him about what had happened, he only shook his head and muttered cryptic phrases about the forest, the bracelet, and a choice that had yet to be made. Meanwhile, Miriam returned to her small shop, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. But the events of the previous night lingered in her mind like an unfinished story. She couldn't stop thinking about the golden stone and the images it had shown her. Though she tried to focus on her work, her thoughts kept drifting back to the cavern, to Joseph, and to the strange bond that seemed to tether them together. It wasn't long before Joseph arrived at her door, his expression grim but determined. "We need to talk," he said. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat at her small wooden table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about what happened," Joseph admitted, his voice low. That stone, it showed me things. Things about my family, the town, and you. It's like it's trying to guide us, but I don't know where. Miriam folded her hands, her brow furrowed. I felt it too. It was like it was showing us the truth about ourselves. But what does it mean? What are we supposed to do with this? Joseph hesitated, his gaze fixed on the table. I think it's connected to the bracelet. My grandmother always said it was a symbol of destiny, a way to find what you were meant for. But if that's true, why did it end up with you? Before Miriam could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Naya, her face pale and drawn. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes darting between Miriam and Joseph. My father is awake, she said, her voice tense. And he's been asking for both of you. He says he needs to tell you something about the bracelet. The three of them returned to the bakery estate, where Naya's father lay in his bed, propped up by pillows. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. He gestured weakly for them to come closer. You found the stone, he said, his voice raspy but steady. It wasn't a question. He spoke as though he already knew. I've been guarding its secret for years, waiting for the day it would reveal itself. And now, it has chosen you. Miriam and Joseph exchanged a glance, confusion etched on their faces. What do you mean? Joseph asked. Naya's father took a slow, deliberate breath. The stone is not just a relic. It is a guide, a force that reveals the truth of our lives and the choices that define us. The bracelet was created to lead the rightful person to it. For generations, my family believed it was meant for us, but now I see. I see that it was meant for something greater. Miriam stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. But why us? We didn't ask for this. No one asks for destiny, he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It finds you, whether you are ready or not. The stone showed you visions, didn't it? It showed you the paths you could take. Joseph nodded slowly. Yes. But what does it mean? What are we supposed to do? That, Naya's father said, is for you to decide. The stone is a test, a challenge to see if you have the strength to follow the path it has laid before you. But be warned, the choices you make will not only shape your lives, but the lives of everyone in this village. This is bigger than any one person. The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy cloak. Miriam felt her heart race as she tried to process what he was saying. The responsibility was overwhelming, and yet, deep down, she felt a strange sense of purpose. As they left the room, Naya pulled Joseph aside. Whatever this is, you need to be careful, she said. My father believes in fate, but I'm not so sure. Don't let this stone control you. Joseph nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't ignore the pull of the stone, the sense that it was leading him towards something he couldn't yet understand. And as he glanced at Miriam, he realized that she was a part of that journey, whether he wanted her to be or not. That night, as Miriam lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. The stone, the bracelet, and Joseph, they were all pieces of a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. But one thing was certain, the choices they made in the coming days would determine not just their own futures, but the future of the entire village. And with that realization came a deep, unshakable resolve. No matter what lay ahead, Miriam knew she couldn't turn back now. Fate had chosen her, and she would see this journey through to the end. The following days unfolded like a dream Miriam couldn't wake from, a strange blend of routine and the extraordinary. The golden stone and the visions it had shown them became an unspoken weight she and Joseph carried, though neither of them dared to reveal its full truth to anyone else, not even Naya. The villagers, sensing the pair's reticence, whispered their own theories about the events in the forest, each more outlandish than the last. But Miriam and Joseph kept to themselves, drawn closer by the shared burden of the mystery. One evening, Joseph appeared at Miriam's shop just as she was closing for the night. His expression was unreadable, but the urgency in his step was unmistakable. Without a word, he gestured for her to follow. They walked through the darkening streets, their path illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns hanging from wooden posts. He led her not to his home or the bakery estate but back to the outskirts of the forest. "I couldn't sleep," Joseph finally admitted as they reached the edge of the trees. "The stone, the visions. It feels like it's calling us back. I can't explain it, but I know we're not finished." Miriam hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "You think we should go back? To the cavern?" Joseph nodded. "Yes. And I think we need to take the bracelet with us." The thought sent a shiver down Miriam's spine. The bracelet, now a permanent fixture on Joseph's wrist, seemed to hum with energy whenever she was near. She had tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but deep down, she knew it was connected to the stone in ways they were only beginning to understand. Reluctantly, she agreed, and they made their way back into the forest. The path to the clearing was eerily familiar, the trees seeming to lean closer as if observing their every move. When they arrived at the ancient tree, Miriam's breath caught in her throat. The roots, which had once writhed and shifted to reveal the cavern entrance, were now still, as though they had never moved. But the faint glow of the carvings on the ground remained, a beacon, drawing them forward. Joseph knelt by the roots, his fingers brushing the intricate patterns. "It's here," he said with certainty. "We just need to figure out how to open it again." Miriam watched as he placed his hand over the bracelet. The moment he did, the carvings began to pulse with light, the rhythm matching the beating of her own heart. The ground trembled slightly, and the roots shifted once more, revealing the dark tunnel leading into the earth. Without hesitation, Joseph stepped forward, and Miriam followed, her fear eclipsed by a strange sense of inevitability. The cavern was just as they had left it, the bluish light illuminating the walls and the pedestal at its center. But this time, the golden box was gone. In its place was a circular depression in the pedestal's surface, the exact size and shape of the bracelet. Joseph removed the bracelet and hesitated, holding it over the depression. "Do you trust me?" he asked, glancing at Miriam. She nodded, though her voice trembled as she said, "I trust you." With that, he placed the bracelet into the depression. The moment it clicked into place, the cavern was bathed in a blinding light. Miriam shielded her eyes, her heart racing as the ground beneath them began to shift. The pedestal sank into the earth, and in its place rose a large, translucent orb, its surface swirling with golden and blue light. From within the orb came a voice, not a voice they could hear with their ears, but one that resonated directly in their minds. It was deep and melodic, carrying the weight of centuries. "You have been chosen," the voice said, each word filling the cavern with an almost tangible energy. "Two souls bound by fate, brought together to fulfill a purpose greater than yourselves." Miriam and Joseph exchanged a glance, their fear giving way to awe. "What purpose?" Miriam asked, her voice barely a whisper. The orb's light pulsed as the voice continued. "This village stands at a crossroads. Its people have lost their way, their hearts consumed by greed, division, and fear. The stone and the bracelet are tools, not of power, but of unity. They must be wielded by those who can guide others back to the path of harmony and understanding." Joseph stepped forward, his hands trembling. "But why us? We're just ordinary people." "There is no such thing as ordinary," the voice replied. "Each choice you have made, each moment that led you here, was part of a greater design. The bracelet found you because you possess the courage to act, and the stone revealed itself to her," the voice said, indicating Miriam, "because she possesses the wisdom to guide you." Miriam felt a lump in her throat as she listened. She thought of her quiet life in the village, of the shop where she had spent years listening to the stories and struggles of her neighbors. She had always thought of herself as unremarkable, a small thread in the fabric of the community. But now, she saw that her role had been far greater than she ever realized. "What happened yesterday has everyone talking. They say you and Joseph stopped that cart together, and now people are wondering," she trailed off, her words heavy with implication. "Wondering what?" Miriam asked, frowning. Adwa sighed, her weathered hands resting on her hips. Joseph is engaged, my dear. To Naya, the daughter of the bakery family. People are saying they saw something in the way you two looked at each other. They're talking about fate, about old stories. Miriam's heart sank. She had done nothing wrong, yet the weight of the market's collective imagination was already pressing down on her. She glanced at her satchel, where the mysterious bracelet lay, and felt a shiver run down her spine. Was this what they meant by fate? A mere coincidence being spun into something larger, something uncontrollable? Meanwhile, Joseph stood at the edge of the market, a conflicted expression on his face. He had not intended to come back today, but his thoughts had been restless all night. The image of Miriam, standing amidst a sea of lilies, haunted him. He couldn't understand why. His life was supposed to be simple, structured. His engagement to Naya had been arranged years ago, a union meant to solidify ties between their families. It was not a love match, but it was expected, and Joseph had always done what was expected of him. And yet, the bracelet complicated everything. It wasn't just an object, it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations, said to symbolize unbreakable bonds. How it had ended up in Miriam's possession was a mystery he needed to solve. When he finally spotted her at her stall, his resolve hardened. He approached cautiously, aware of the eyes that followed his every step. "Miriam," he said softly, his voice carrying over the hum of the market. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Joseph," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I need to talk to you," he said, glancing around nervously. "Somewhere private." The request took her by surprise, but she nodded. Together, they walked to a quieter corner of the market, near an old well, surrounded by ancient baobab trees. Once there, Miriam reached into her satchel and pulled out the bracelet, holding it out to him. "This," she said simply. "I believe it's yours." Joseph's eyes widened as he took the bracelet, his fingers trembling. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my basket after the incident yesterday," she explained. "I thought it might have fallen during the chaos." He turned the bracelet over in his hands, his mind racing. The design was unmistakable, a sunburst surrounded by interwoven vines. His grandmother had once told him the story of the bracelet, a tale rooted in the town's folklore. According to legend, it was crafted by an ancient blacksmith who claimed it held the power to reveal true love. Miriam and Joseph exchanged a glance, their fear giving way to awe. "What purpose?" Miriam asked, her voice barely a whisper. The orb's light pulsed as the voice continued. "This village stands at a crossroads. Its people have lost their way, their hearts consumed by greed, division, and fear. The stone and the bracelet are tools, not of power, but of unity. They must be wielded by those who can guide others back to the path of harmony and understanding." Joseph stepped forward, his hands trembling. "But why us? We're just ordinary people." "There is no such thing as ordinary," the voice replied. "Each choice you have made, each moment that led you here, was part of a greater design. The bracelet found you because you possess the courage to act, and the stone revealed itself to her," the voice said, indicating Miriam, "because she possesses the wisdom to guide you." Miriam felt a lump in her throat as she listened. She thought of her quiet life in the village, of the shop where she had spent years listening to the stories and struggles of her neighbors. She had always thought of herself as unremarkable, a small thread in the fabric of the community. But now, she saw that her role had been far greater than she ever realized. "What happens now?" she asked. The orb began to fade, its light dimming as the voice spoke one final time. "The path is yours to walk. The choices you make will shape the future of this village and beyond. Trust in each other, and trust in the power of unity. The answers you seek will come in time." As the orb vanished, the cavern fell silent once more. Miriam and Joseph stood in the faint blue light, their minds racing with the weight of what they had just experienced. Slowly, Joseph retrieved the bracelet from the pedestal, slipping it back onto his wrist. When they returned to the surface, the forest seemed different. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The village, too, felt lighter, as though the weight that had hung over it for so long had finally been lifted. In the weeks that followed, Miriam and Joseph began to notice subtle changes. Disputes among neighbors were resolved more quickly. Families that had been estranged found their way back to each other. The village, once divided by petty rivalries, began to come together in ways Miriam had never thought possible. Though they never spoke of the cavern or the orb to anyone else, Miriam and Joseph carried its message in their hearts. They worked quietly but diligently, using their influence to foster understanding and unity among their neighbors. And though the stone and its mysteries remained a secret, its impact was felt in every corner of the village. One evening, as they stood together on the hill overlooking the town, Joseph turned to Miriam. "Do you ever wonder if we'll see it again?" he asked. Miriam smiled, her gaze fixed on the lights of the village below. "I think we're seeing it every day," she said softly. "In the people, in their kindness." That's what it meant, didn't it? The stone wasn't about power, it was about reminding us what we're capable of when we work together. Joseph nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Then I guess our work isn't done." And as the stars shone above them, Miriam and Joseph stood side by side, ready to face whatever the future held, knowing they had already begun to shape a brighter path for their village, and for themselves.